Marcus Wilson dragged his tired feet along the wet sidewalk as the cold rain soaked through his cheap work shirt. The water dripped from his dark hair into his eyes, making everything look blurry and sad. His black work shoes made squeaking sounds on the pavement with each heavy step he took toward home. The day had been terrible from the very beginning. Marcus woke up late because his old alarm clock stopped working during the night. He rushed to get ready for work but spilled coffee all over his clean white shirt. Then he had to change clothes, which made him even more late for his job at the furniture store. When Marcus finally arrived at work, his boss, Mr. Henderson, was already angry and waiting for him near the front door. The older man had gray hair and mean eyes that always seemed to find fault with everything Marcus did. Mr. Henderson yelled at Marcus in front of all the other workers and customers. He called Marcus lazy and unreliable. The harsh words made Marcus feel small and ashamed. During lunchtime, Marcus discovered that someone had stolen his sandwich from the break room refrigerator. He had to spend his last $5 on expensive food from the vending machine. The chips were stale, and the soda was warm. Marcus sat alone at a small table thinking about how nothing ever seemed to go right in his life. The afternoon brought even more problems. Marcus was helping an elderly woman choose a new sofa for her living room. She seemed nice at first and asked many questions about the different furniture pieces. Marcus spent almost 2 hours showing her various sofas and chairs. He explained the prices and different colors available. The woman nodded and smiled like she was very interested in buying something expensive. But then the woman suddenly changed her mind about everything. She said the furniture was too expensive and not good enough quality. She complained loudly to Mr. Henderson about Marcus wasting her time. She claimed that Marcus had been rude to her, even though he had been very polite and helpful. Mr. Henderson believed the customer instead of Marcus. Mr. Henderson called Marcus into his small office at the back of the store. The office smelled like old coffee and cigarettes. There were papers scattered everywhere on the desk. Mr. Henderson told Marcus that he was getting too many customer complaints. He said that Marcus needed to work harder or he would lose his job soon. The threat scared Marcus because he needed the money to pay his rent and buy food. After work, Marcus discovered that someone had scratched his old car in the parking lot. There was a long, deep scratch along the side door that would cost money to fix. Money that Marcus did not have. He stood in the rain looking at the damage and feeling angry at the whole world. The bus that Marcus usually took home was late because of the heavy rain. He waited for 30 minutes, getting more and more wet. When the bus finally arrived, it was crowded with people who smelled like wet clothes and frustration. Marcus had to stand in the aisle holding onto a dirty metal pole while the bus lurched and swayed through traffic. By the time Marcus got off the bus near his apartment building, the rain was falling harder than before. He walked quickly with his head down, trying to avoid the worst of the storm. His socks were completely soaked inside his shoes. Water ran down his back, making him shiver with cold. Marcus felt like everyone and everything was against him. The bad day had piled one problem on top of another until he could barely think straight. His head hurt and his stomach was empty. All he wanted was to get home and forget about this terrible day. As he turned the corner onto his street, Marcus saw a small brown dog sitting quietly beside a green trash can. The dog was wet from the rain, but it looked up at Marcus with big, innocent eyes. Its tail wagged slowly back and forth like it was hoping for some kindness from a stranger. But Marcus was too angry and frustrated to care about a stray dog. All his problems and bad feelings came rushing together in that moment. Without thinking clearly, Marcus lifted his foot and kicked the small animal hard with his wet shoe. Marcus watched the small brown dog limp away into the darkness between two old houses. The poor animal was whimpering softly as it disappeared from sight. For a moment, Marcus felt a tiny bit of guilt about what he had done, but his anger was still too strong to really care. He expected to hear the dog crying or barking as it ran away to find somewhere safe to hide. Marcus thought the animal would make the usual sounds that hurt dogs make when they are scared and in pain. But instead of normal dog sounds, something very different reached his ears. A low, deep growling noise started somewhere behind Marcus. The sound was much deeper and more threatening than any noise the small dog could have made. It was not the high-pitched whine or yelp that comes from a hurt animal. This growling was something else entirely. Marcus stopped walking and stood very still on the wet sidewalk. The rain continued to fall on his head and shoulders, but he barely noticed it anymore. All his attention was focused on the strange sound coming from behind him. The growling was getting louder and more intense with each passing second. The noise did not sound like it was coming from any normal dog that Marcus had ever heard before. It was too deep and too human sounding, but it also was not completely human either. It was something in between that made the hair on the back of Marcus' neck stand up straight. Marcus felt his heart start to beat faster inside his chest. His hands began to shake slightly, and his breathing became quick and shallow. The angry feelings from his bad day were quickly being replaced by fear and confusion. What kind of animal could make such a terrifying sound? The growling continued without stopping. It seemed to be getting closer to where Marcus was standing. He could hear something moving on the wet pavement behind him. It sounded like footsteps, but not quite normal footsteps. There was something strange about the rhythm and pattern of the sounds. Marcus wanted to turn around and see what was making the frightening noise, but he was almost too scared to move. His whole body felt frozen in place. The growling was now so loud and close that it seemed to be coming from just a few feet away from his back. Finally, Marcus gathered enough courage to slowly turn his head and look over his shoulder. He expected to see a large, angry dog that was upset about what he had done to the smaller animal. Maybe it was the mother or father of the dog he had kicked. Maybe it was just another stray dog that did not like people who hurt other animals. But when Marcus turned around, he saw something that made his blood feel like ice water in his veins. There was no dog behind him at all. Instead, there was something much more shocking and terrifying than any animal he could have imagined. Crouched down on the wet sidewalk just 10 feet away from Marcus was a full-grown man. But this man was not standing up like a normal person. He was down on his hands and knees like a wild animal. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his long hair hung down over his face like a curtain. The most frightening thing was that this strange man was the source of all the growling sounds. He was making those deep, threatening noises with his own human throat and mouth. His lips were pulled back, showing his teeth like an angry dog ready to bite. Marcus stared at the crouched man in complete shock and disbelief. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth hung slightly open as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The rain continued to fall around both of them, but Marcus did not notice the cold water anymore. The strange man was positioned exactly like a large dog ready to attack. His knees and hands pressed against the wet concrete, while his back was arched upward. His breathing was heavy and rapid, like he had been running for a long distance. Steam seemed to rise from his body in the cold night air. Marcus could see that the man's clothes had once been normal everyday clothing. There were torn pieces of what looked like an old blue shirt hanging from his shoulders. His pants were ripped at the knees and covered with mud and stains. Everything about his appearance suggested he had been living rough for a very long time. The man's hair was long and tangled with bits of leaves and dirt stuck throughout. It hung down past his shoulders in greasy strands that looked like they had not been washed or combed in months. His beard was also long and unkempt, covering most of his face, except for his wild, staring eyes. But it was those eyes that scared Marcus the most. They were not the eyes of a normal person having a normal day. These eyes looked completely wild and dangerous, like those of a predator hunting for prey. They seemed to glow slightly in the dim light from the street lamp nearby. The man's fingernails were extremely long and dirty. They looked more like claws than human nails. Marcus wondered how anyone could let their nails grow so long without cutting them. They were curved and sharp-looking, like they could easily scratch and tear. Marcus rubbed his own eyes hard with his wet hands, thinking that maybe the stress of his terrible day was making him see things that were not really there. Maybe the rain and darkness were playing tricks on his mind. Maybe he was so tired and upset that he was imagining this whole scary situation. But when Marcus opened his eyes again, the crouched man was still there. In fact, he seemed even more real and frightening than before. The growling sounds were still coming from deep in the man's throat. The noise was constant and threatening, like a warning of danger to come. Marcus noticed that the man's shoes were completely worn out with holes in the bottom. His feet were dirty and his toes were visible through the torn material. It looked like he had been walking for many miles without proper footwear. The skin on his feet was dark with dirt and possibly blood. The smell that came from the strange man was terrible. Even in the rain, Marcus could detect the odor of someone who had not bathed in a very long time. It was a mixture of sweat and dirt and other unpleasant things that made Marcus want to hold his breath. The man slowly moved his head from side to side while never taking his intense stare away from Marcus. The movement was smooth and controlled, like a wild animal studying its target before making a move. His neck seemed unusually flexible as he tilted his head in different directions. Marcus realized that his whole body was shaking now, and not just from the cold rain. Fear was spreading through him like electricity. Every instinct in his body was telling him to run away as fast as possible. But his legs felt weak and unsteady, like they might not support him if he tried to move quickly. The growling man seemed to sense Marcus' fear, and the sound he was making became even deeper and more menacing. He shifted his weight slightly forward on his hands, as if he was preparing to spring into action at any moment. The strange crouched man suddenly stopped his growling and became completely silent. The sudden quiet was even more frightening than the threatening sounds had been. Marcus could hear his own heart beating loudly in his chest and the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement around them. For several long seconds, the two men stared at each other without moving. Marcus was frozen in place by fear, while the wild man remained perfectly still in his animal-like position. The tension in the air felt thick and dangerous, like something terrible was about to happen. Then the crouched man slowly lifted his head higher and looked directly into Marcus' eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough and scratchy, like he had not used it for talking in a very long time. The words came out slowly and clearly despite his wild appearance. "You hurt innocent things," the man said in a low, threatening tone. His voice sounded like gravel and broken glass. "Now you pay for what you did to that poor animal. Nobody should kick a helpless creature that never did anything wrong to them." Marcus felt his blood turn cold when he heard those words. He realized that this strange person had been watching when he kicked the small brown dog. The man had seen everything that happened, and now he wanted some kind of revenge or punishment for Marcus' cruel action. The wild man's eyes seemed to glow brighter with anger as he continued to stare at Marcus. His lips pulled back even further, showing more of his teeth. The expression on his face was not completely human anymore. It was the face of something that lived by different rules than normal people. Marcus did not wait to hear anything else that the frightening man might say. Every survival instinct in his body suddenly kicked in at the same time. His fear gave him a burst of energy and strength that he did not know he had. Without thinking about it anymore, Marcus turned and started running as fast as his legs could carry him. His wet shoes slipped slightly on the slick pavement as he pushed himself to run faster than he had run since he was a child. His arms pumped back and forth to help him maintain his balance and speed. The cold rain hit his face as he ran, but he barely felt it through his panic and fear. Behind him, Marcus could hear the wild man starting to move. There were sounds of hands and feet scrambling on the wet concrete. The sounds were not like normal human footsteps or running. Instead, they were more like the sounds an animal would make when chasing something through the night. Marcus could hear the growling starting again behind him. This time it was mixed with heavy breathing and what sounded like snarling. The noises were getting closer, which meant the strange man was actually chasing him through the dark streets of his neighborhood. Marcus ran toward his apartment building, which was still several blocks away. He hoped he could reach the safety of his home before the wild man caught up with him. His lungs were already starting to burn from the effort of running so hard in the cold, wet air. The sounds behind him were definitely getting closer. Marcus could hear the scraping of hands and knees on pavement mixed with the slapping sounds of bare feet hitting puddles. The rhythm was strange and uneven, like someone who was not used to running on two legs. Marcus glanced back over his shoulder while still running forward. What he saw made him run even faster despite his burning lungs and aching legs. The wild man was following him and moving in the most terrifying way Marcus had ever seen a person move. Marcus ran through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, but everything looked completely different in the darkness and rain. The houses that he passed every day on his way to work now seemed strange and threatening. Shadows from trees and buildings created dark shapes that looked like monsters waiting to grab him. The streetlights made everything look yellow and scary. Marcus could see his own shadow running along beside him on the wet sidewalk. Behind his shadow, he could sometimes see another shadow that was moving in a very strange way. It would sometimes look like a person running and sometimes like an animal crawling. Marcus tried to run in a straight line toward his apartment, but he kept slipping on the wet pavement. His shoes were not made for running, and they had no grip on the slick concrete. Several times he almost fell down but managed to catch himself and keep moving forward. The sounds behind him were changing as the chase continued. Sometimes Marcus could hear normal footsteps, like the wild man was running upright like a regular person. But then the sounds would change to the scraping and patting noises of someone moving on their hands and knees. When Marcus looked back again, he saw something that made his stomach feel sick with fear. The strange man was sometimes running on two legs like a normal human being, but other times he would drop down to all fours and move like a large dog or wolf chasing its prey through the night. The wild man seemed to know the neighborhood much better than Marcus had expected. When Marcus turned left onto Oak Street thinking he could lose his pursuer, the man took a shortcut through someone's backyard. Marcus could hear him crashing through bushes and jumping over fences to stay close behind. Marcus realized that the wild man was not just chasing him randomly. He was hunting Marcus like a predator that had chosen its target and would not give up until it caught what it was after. This was not just an angry person who would get tired and stop chasing. This was something much more dangerous. The rain was making it hard for Marcus to see clearly. Water kept getting in his eyes, and everything looked blurry and confusing. He wiped his face with his hand while still running, but it did not help much. The whole world seemed gray and wet, and full of scary shadows. Marcus tried running down Miller Avenue, which was usually busy with cars even at night. He hoped that other people or traffic might scare away his pursuer. But the street was empty because of the heavy rain. There were no cars driving by, and no people walking around who might help him. Behind him, the growling sounds continued, but now they were mixed with other noises that Marcus did not recognize. Sometimes it sounded like the wild man was talking to himself in a language that was not quite human. Other times he made clicking sounds with his tongue, like he was calling to some invisible animal. Marcus turned onto Pine Street and ran past the old elementary school where he had gone as a child. The playground equipment looked like strange metal creatures in the darkness. The swings moved back and forth in the wind, making creaking sounds that added to the nightmare atmosphere of the chase. The wild man seemed to be getting closer despite all of Marcus' efforts to escape. The sounds behind him were louder now, and Marcus could sometimes hear heavy breathing that sounded like it was coming from someone who was very excited about the hunt. Marcus' legs were starting to feel weak and shaky from all the running. His chest hurt from breathing so hard, and his throat was dry and scratchy. He was not used to this much physical activity, and his body was telling him that he could not keep running much longer. But every time Marcus thought about slowing down or stopping to rest, he would hear the frightening sounds behind him and find new energy to keep going. The terror of being caught by the wild man was stronger than his physical exhaustion. Marcus was running out of breath and energy as he reached Elm Street, where many of his neighbors lived. His legs felt like they were made of rubber, and his lungs burned with every breath he took. He knew he could not keep running much longer before he would collapse from exhaustion. He decided to try getting help from someone who lived nearby. Marcus ran up to the front door of Mrs. Peterson's house and started banging on it with his fists. He pounded as hard as he could while looking back over his shoulder to see if the wild man was still following him. Mrs. Peterson was an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. She was known for being kind to everyone and always willing to help people who were in trouble. Marcus hoped she would let him inside where he would be safe from his dangerous pursuer. "Help me, please," Marcus shouted while continuing to bang on the wooden door. "There is a crazy man chasing me, and I think he wants to hurt me. Please open the door and let me come inside where it is safe. I need to call the police right away." Marcus could hear footsteps inside the house and the sound of locks being turned. Mrs. Peterson opened the door slowly and peeked out through the small opening. She was wearing a pink bathrobe, and her gray hair was in curlers. She looked surprised and confused to see Marcus standing on her porch so late at night. "What in the world is going on out here?" Mrs. Peterson asked in a worried voice. "You are soaking wet, and you look absolutely terrified. What are you talking about? Someone chasing you?" "I do not see anyone else out there in the rain." Marcus tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and confused because he was breathing so hard. He told her about kicking the dog, and then seeing the strange wild man who had been chasing him through the neighborhood. He begged her to let him come inside and hide. Mrs. Peterson looked past Marcus and studied the empty street carefully. She could see the rain falling under the streetlights, but there was no sign of any other person anywhere. The neighborhood looked completely quiet and normal to her eyes. "I do not see anyone chasing you, dear," Mrs. Peterson said in a gentle but doubtful voice. "Are you sure you are feeling all right? Maybe you should go home and get some rest. You look like you have had a very difficult day, and sometimes stress can make us imagine things that are not really there." Other neighbors had heard the commotion and were starting to come outside to see what was happening. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson from next door appeared on their front porch. The Williams family from across the street opened their door and looked out. Everyone seemed curious about why Marcus was making so much noise so late at night. Marcus tried to tell all of them about the wild man who had been chasing him, but none of them could see anyone else in the area. They all looked at Marcus with expressions that showed they thought he might be having some kind of mental breakdown or emotional crisis. The neighbors whispered among themselves about whether they should call someone to come help Marcus. Some of them thought he might have been drinking alcohol or taking drugs that were making him see things that were not real. Others wondered if he was having a nervous breakdown from work stress. Marcus felt embarrassed and confused as he realized that no one believed his story. He looked around desperately, trying to spot the wild man who had been following him, but there was no sign of anyone else on the quiet street. Had he imagined the whole terrifying experience? But Marcus knew what he had seen and heard. The memory of the growling sounds and the sight of the man crouched on all fours was still clear and vivid in his mind. He could not have imagined something so detailed and frightening. The wild man had been real and had been chasing him. Maybe the strange person was very good at hiding or had given up the chase when he saw all the neighbors coming outside. Marcus wondered if the wild man was still nearby, watching from behind a tree or building, waiting for him to be alone again. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling confused and unsure about what had really happened the night before. The bright sunlight streaming through his bedroom window made the terrifying chase seem like it might have been just a very bad dream. But his sore legs and the mud on his shoes proved that he had definitely been running through the rain. Marcus decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to see if he could find any signs of the wild man who had chased him. He wanted to prove to himself that the whole experience had been real and not just his imagination playing tricks on him during a stressful time. As Marcus walked past the houses on his street, he ran into Mr. Johnson, who was getting his morning newspaper from his front yard. Mr. Johnson was an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 30 years. He knew everyone who lived nearby and all the stories about what had happened over the decades. "Good morning, Marcus," Mr. Johnson said with a friendly smile. "I heard there was some excitement on the street last night. Mrs. Peterson told me you seemed pretty upset about something. Are you feeling better today after getting some sleep?" Marcus felt embarrassed about the scene he had caused, but he was still curious about whether anyone else had seen the strange wild man. He decided to ask Mr. Johnson if he knew anything about unusual people who might be living in the area. "Mr. Johnson, have you ever seen anyone strange walking around the neighborhood at night?" Marcus asked carefully. "Someone who might not look like a regular person. Maybe someone who has been living rough or hiding somewhere nearby. Mr. Johnson's expression became more serious as he thought about Marcus' question. He looked around to make sure no one else was listening, and then motioned for Marcus to come closer so they could talk privately. "Well, now that you mention it," Mr. Johnson said in a quiet voice, "there is someone I should probably tell you about. His name is David Mitchell, and he used to live in that old abandoned house at the end of Maple Street, the one with the broken windows and the overgrown yard." Marcus felt his heart start beating faster as Mr. Johnson continued with his story. He had a feeling that this David person might be connected to what had happened to him the night before. David was a normal young man when he left for the war about 15 years ago, Mr. Johnson explained. He had a job and friends and seemed like a regular guy who would come back and settle down with a nice family. But something terrible happened to him over there that changed him completely. Mr. Johnson said that David had come back from the war with serious mental problems that made him unable to live a normal life anymore. The doctors tried to help him, but nothing seemed to work. David started acting more and more strange until his family did not know how to handle him. He began to believe that he was some kind of guardian or protector of all the innocent creatures in the neighborhood, Mr. Johnson continued. He thought it was his job to watch over every cat and dog and bird and make sure no one hurt them. He would get very angry if he saw anyone being cruel to animals. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to this explanation. It was starting to make sense why the wild man had been so upset about him kicking the small brown dog. In David's mind, Marcus had committed a terrible crime that needed to be punished. David's family tried to get him professional help, but he would not stay in any hospital or treatment center, Mr. Johnson said sadly. He would always run away and come back to live like a homeless person in the woods and abandoned buildings around here. The police have tried to help him many times, but he is very good at hiding. Mr. Johnson explained that David had been living like a wild animal for many years now. He came out mostly at night to look for food and to check on the stray animals that he considered to be under his protection. Most neighbors had heard stories about him, but very few people had actually seen him up close. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of staying safely inside his apartment, he decided to go back out and look for David. He wanted to face his fear and try to apologize for what he had done to the small brown dog. Marcus realized that running away and hiding would not solve anything. Marcus put on his warmest jacket and walked slowly through the neighborhood as the sun was setting. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and damp. He felt nervous about trying to find David, but he knew it was the right thing to do. He walked to the end of Maple Street where Mr. Johnson had said the abandoned house was located. The old building looked dark and scary with broken windows and boards covering some of the openings. The yard was full of tall weeds and dead bushes that had not been trimmed in many years. Marcus walked carefully around the back of the house looking for any signs that someone might be living there. He found old cans and bottles scattered around along with some torn pieces of clothing. There were also small piles of food scraps that looked like they had been left out for stray animals. Then Marcus heard a soft sound coming from behind a large tree near the back fence. He moved closer and saw David sitting on the ground with his back against the tree trunk. The wild man was gently feeding pieces of bread to 3 small cats that had gathered around him. David looked up when he heard Marcus' footsteps on the wet leaves. His eyes were still wild and alert, but he did not immediately start growling like he had the night before. Instead, he watched Marcus carefully while continuing to give food to the hungry cats. Marcus stopped walking when he was about 10 feet away from David. He could see that the strange man looked even more thin and dirty in the daylight. His clothes were in worse condition than Marcus had realized, and his hair was even more tangled and messy. "I came to say I am sorry," David, Marcus said in a quiet, respectful voice. "What I did to that dog last night was wrong, and I feel terrible about it. I was having a bad day, but that is no excuse for hurting an innocent animal that never did anything to me." David stopped feeding the cats and looked directly at Marcus for a long time without saying anything. His expression was hard to read, but Marcus could see that he was thinking carefully about the apology. The cats continued to eat the breadcrumbs while staying close to David for protection. Marcus sat down slowly on a fallen log nearby to show that he was not planning to run away or cause any trouble. He wanted David to see that he was being sincere about wanting to make things right between them. "I know you were watching when I kicked that poor dog," Marcus continued. "You saw me do something cruel, and you wanted to stop me or teach me a lesson. I understand why you were angry and why you chased me. You were protecting something that could not protect itself." David tilted his head slightly to one side, like he was studying Marcus to see if he really meant what he was saying. His breathing was calmer now, and he was not making any of the frightening growling sounds from the night before. The small brown dog came limping out from behind another tree and walked slowly toward David. Marcus could see that the animal was still hurting from being kicked, but it seemed to trust David completely. The dog lay down next to David and put its head on his leg. Marcus felt a wave of shame wash over him when he saw the injured dog. He realized how much pain he had caused to a creature that had done nothing wrong. The guilt was much stronger now than it had been the night before when he was too angry to think clearly. "I promise I will never hurt another animal again," Marcus said while looking at the small brown dog. "I will also bring food for the strays in this neighborhood if that would help them. I want to do something good to make up for the bad thing I did." David continued to stare at Marcus without speaking for what felt like a very long time. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not threatening either. Marcus could tell that David was deciding whether to trust him or not. The injured brown dog stayed close to David's side, as if it was also waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, David spoke in a voice that was much quieter and more normal than it had been during the chase. His words came out slowly and carefully, like he was not used to having conversations with other people very often. "Animals trust us," David said, while gently petting the small brown dog. "They depend on us to take care of them and keep them safe from harm. When we hurt them, we hurt ourselves too. We become less human when we are cruel to creatures that cannot fight back." Marcus listened carefully to David's words and realized that despite his mental problems, this strange man understood something very important about kindness and responsibility. David had learned through his own pain and suffering how precious and fragile innocent life could be. "The war taught me that there is already too much cruelty in the world," David continued. "I saw too many terrible things happen to people and animals who did not deserve to suffer. When I came back home, I promised myself that I would protect the innocent ones who live around here." Marcus began to understand that David was not just a crazy person living in the woods. He was someone who had been deeply hurt by his experiences, but had chosen to use his pain to help others rather than to cause more harm. His strange behavior was his way of trying to make the world a little bit safer for those who needed protection. David reached into a torn pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded many times. He handed it to Marcus, who opened it carefully. Written in pencil were the words, "Every small act of kindness matters in this dark world." Marcus realized that David had been carrying this reminder with him as he lived his difficult life on the streets. It was his way of remembering why he had chosen to be a guardian for the stray animals, even though it meant living alone and being misunderstood by everyone else. From that day forward, Marcus kept his promise to never hurt another innocent creature, no matter how bad his day might be. He started bringing bags of dog food and cat food to leave near the abandoned house where David lived. He never saw David taking the food, but it was always gone by the next morning. Marcus also began to change other things about his life. When he had bad days at work, he would think about David's words and remember that his own problems were small compared to what some people and animals had to endure. He started treating his coworkers with more patience and kindness. Sometimes in the evenings, Marcus would walk through the neighborhood and see David watching the stray animals from a distance. David would nod slightly when he saw Marcus, but they did not speak again. Both men understood that their brief conversation had changed something important between them. Marcus learned that our worst moments can become opportunities to grow into better people if we are willing to listen and learn from them. He discovered that sometimes the strangest encounters can teach us the most valuable lessons about what it really means to be human. The small brown dog that Marcus had kicked eventually healed from its injuries. Marcus would often see it playing with other stray animals near the abandoned house. The dog seemed happy and healthy, which made Marcus feel like he had been forgiven for his moment of cruelty. Years later, Marcus would tell people that meeting David had been one of the most important experiences of his life. It taught him that everyone has the power to choose between causing harm or creating kindness in the world. Marcus chose kindness and never regretted that decision.